Hello everyone, welcome to Chapter 5. Chapter 5 deals with processing persuasive communication messages, and this chapter is dedicated to better understanding the ways in which people make sense of messages and how they cognitively process these messages and how these processes influence attitude maintenance, change, or attitude adoption. So let's get started. So why should we seek to understand the processing of messages? Well, primarily, if we can understand how it is that people process messages and how they make sense of messages and interpret these messages, then as communication scholars or as persuasion experts, we can better utilize our communication, our messages, and our communication campaigns to impact persuasion. So the power of thought is really something that is central to the processing of persuasive communication. So obviously we're interested in not only the thoughts that people have or the cognitions that people have, but also the attitudes or the feelings that people carry with them about these various issues that we may be addressing. The thoughts that we have internally when we listen to a message, after the message is done, influence how we persuade ourselves, right? So most of us already know that on a daily basis, we are engaging in self-persuasion. We've talked about this before in our course. We persuade ourselves to get up in the morning and to go to class or to go to work. We persuade ourselves to delay gratification so that we can accomplish the projects and the goals that have to be completed so that we can have a long-term goal accomplishment, such as getting a degree or finishing classwork or making steps that are substantial towards establishing ourselves in a certain career path, right? So all of these internal thinking processes influence self-persuasion, which in turn influence the attitudes we have and the thoughts we carry, and of course, the behaviors that we end up enacting. So what we can do when we understand the power of thought is we are able to better understand the way that we can shape behavior. So generally speaking, when people have a favorable attitude towards a behavior, they will also have more positive intentions to carry out that behavior. This is not that surprising, right? And so as communication scholars or as persuasion experts, we want to seek to understand how is it that we can shape the attitudes that people end up cultivating towards certain behaviors, which in turn, of course, will shape their intentions to engage in a certain behavior, which also can shape our beliefs in self-actualization. So what is self-actualization? Well, that is basically the belief that we are able and competent and capable to enact a certain type of behavior to achieve a certain outcome. So these are all very important aspects of cognitive processing, and we're going to go into each of these in more detail throughout this chapter. The Hovland persuasion model is one of the first persuasion models that looked at the effects of persuasive communication. Now, Carl Hovland was a professor and researcher at Yale University, and this study was one of the first studies that looked at the way in which communicator credibility, message appeals, and the audience members' actual personality traits would influence how people were persuaded. So, this model suggests the following. First of all, the model suggests that communication messages or communication delivery or any kind of a communication speech, or you could even be thinking about a paper or even a conversation with another individual, right, as a type of a communication. A communication interaction shapes the messages or the ideas that we learn about, okay? So do we learn something? What do we learn? Which, of course, can shape the attitudes that people develop about a various topic. So, according to Hovland, attitude change takes place in 5 steps. The first of these is attending or paying attention to the message, okay? This is clearly very central to persuasion because if we are tuning somebody out or not paying attention, then it would be very difficult for us to actually embrace and process the message that someone is seeking to pass on to us. So attending to the message is the first step in persuasion. The second step in persuasion is comprehension or understanding the message. This is one of the reasons why, as a communicator, it is so important for us to tailor our messages so that it is appropriate for the knowledge level of the audience, okay? Generally speaking, when we think about reaching the widest group of people or the largest number of people with our messages, the typical standard that I talk to my students about and that I myself tend to tailor my messages, whether it's papers or lectures or things like that, the typical standard is that you want to work to address an audience that has the knowledge level of about a 15-year-old person, okay? In terms of the terms, intellectual capability, things like that. Now, this is a good general norm to work from, all right? And what does this mean? Well, this means that you probably do not want to use terms that are difficult for people to understand without any kind of prior knowledge. If you do evoke certain terms that the audience is not likely to know about, you need to define those terms before you start drawing from them in a persuasion presentation, right? Now, certainly, if you are giving a speech or writing a paper to a particular type of audience, then you can modify that message so that it is appropriate with the knowledge level of that audience, right? So let's say, for example, you're giving a speech at some kind of a business conference, and most of the people who are at this conference are graduates of a business degree program, all right? Now, if you have those people as your basic audience level of analysis or audience level of understanding, what that means is that you can probably safely evoke certain terms that the general population might not know, because you know that those people that you're speaking to have a foundation of knowledge in business, and they won't be confused if you evoke very basic sort of routine terms in your speech, okay? So, but the general idea here is you always want to tailor your message to the audience level's ability to comprehend and understand. This deals with not only the words and the language that you use, but it also deals with the content of the information. Okay, so that's something that we really always want to be conscious of whenever we're developing or disseminating a persuasive message. The third thing is learning. So according to Hovland, if people can engage in some kind of a learning process while they are listening to your persuasive message, then that is actually more likely to influence persuasion. I think that that is a very interesting finding in the research. And this is something that you can even think about in terms of your own experiences, listening to lectures, reading books, reading papers, going and seeing public speakers in the community that are representing various issues or topics in the world, right? So learning probably is a process that tends to make a message more memorable, which of course can shape the persuasive ability of that message. So if you can do something to teach your audience something during the persuasive speech, that is something, according to Hovland, that will enhance persuasion. The fourth thing that Hovland talks about is getting people to accept the message or accept the content that you seek to convey to them. So let's say you're attempting to teach me something in your final presentation, okay? If I accept the message of what you're teaching me, and I accept that you're a credible source to teach that message or to convey that message, and I accept the content of the message, and I'm able to comprehend the content because you're using language and terminology that is at my level of understanding, according to Hovland, I am more likely to accept the message, and I will engage in learning. And of course, engaging in more learning will persuade me or will enhance my ability or desire to accept that message. Finally, Hovland talks about the importance of being able to retain or recall a message, okay? So obviously, if you want to persuade somebody or a group of people to do something, you want them to remember your message after you're done delivering it, right? So this is why when we tend to give speeches or when we tend to write a paper, I always tend to tell students that at the beginning of the speech or at the beginning of the paper in your introduction, you want to give an overview of what the area is that you will be talking about. You want to tell the audience what you're going to tell them. Okay, you do that typically in any kind of introduction, whether it's a paper or a speech. During the body of the speech or during the body of the paper, you tell the audience the main points. Okay, 1, 2, 3. At the end of today, these are the 3 points I want you to take away. You go through the 3 points in detail, provide more information. Okay, and then at the end of the speech, as you're concluding the speech, you want to tell the audience what you told them. The reason for doing speeches and papers in this format is because there is a finding in research about the primacy and recency effect in recall of messages. The primacy effect is that people tend to recall or remember the first thing that they hear in a message, okay? And the recency effect is that people tend to recall or draw from the last thing that they heard in a message, okay? So primacy is the first thing you tell them. Recency is the last thing you've told them, all right? And this is why it is so important for us as communicators to always talk about what we're going to say, deliver the message in the body, and then, of course, you want to reinforce what you told the audience at the conclusion point so that they take away that very central, important message, which ideally you should be able to narrow down to about a sentence or two, okay? So, according to Hovland, communication messages are more persuasive when we can create some kind of learning for the audience, which in turn will shape attitude change or attitude adoption, okay? So the first process of this is attending to the message, paying attention. The second aspect of this is being able to comprehend and understand the message. The third process deals with establishing some kind of a learning for the audience, telling them something new or showing them something that they haven't thought about before. The fourth process deals with acceptance, and according to Hovland, if you teach your audience members something in terms of learning, they're more likely to accept your message, all right? And then the last aspect is retaining the message or being able to recall the message so that they are able to draw from that information in future behavioral decisions, okay? So moving on to another model, it's good to just be aware of the fact that Hovland is one of the more foundational theorists in this area. And of course, you can be using any of these, and hopefully you are drawing from all of these models when you are developing your persuasive campaigns and, of course, delivering them in terms of your actual outline and the content of the message, and, of course, the main points that you touch on and how you deliver those. The cognitive response model is a model that suggests that the cognitive reactions that people have to a message is actually more important than the message itself. From this perspective, people tend to have their own individual cognitions or thoughts about a message, and those thoughts can be very persuasive in whether people decide to adopt an attitude or belief or behavior or whether they reject it. So, pro-arguments are any kind of thoughts, ideas, assumptions, conclusions that are in support of the actual message that we're listening to. Counter-arguments are any kinds of thoughts, ideas, conclusions, or assumptions that challenge or that contradict the message that we're being exposed to. One of the things that the cognitive response model emphasizes is that the process of forewarning can be either useful or actually can inhibit persuasion depending on how it's used. So, for example, according to this model and based on research, if people are warned that they are about to be exposed to a message that they will most likely disagree with, or that most of the general population does not agree with, or something like that, then according to this perspective, people will have the ability, before they even hear the message, to generate a whole host of counter arguments which will actually work against their ability to be persuaded once the message is delivered. So you can think about a situation, for example, where you're having maybe a heated debate or a disagreement with, a parent or a friend or a partner, and perhaps you don't have the time to finish the conversation, and you say to the person, "We're going to talk about this later," and you walk out, or perhaps they say that to you and they walk out, right? So what do you think you're going to be spending the rest of the afternoon doing? You're probably going to be thinking of further arguments or further reasons or excuses why your position is the correct position, especially if you have the warning that you're going to be expected later on to engage in some kind of a debate or dialogue where there's, an intention to persuade, right? So from a persuasive standpoint, what this means is if you are going to present a message that you expect people to disagree with, you probably would not want to forewarn them before you tell the message to them that you're about to deliver such a message, okay? Because according to this model, it gives people much more of a chance to generate a whole host of reasons why they already disagree with you even before you've delivered the message, okay? Now, on the other hand, this principle of forewarning can actually be used to inoculate, in a sense, people against messages in the future that could lead them to engage in negative behavior. So for example, if you think about a campaign where we're trying to reduce risky sex behavior among, let's say, high school students in the state of Idaho, right? So if we have a campaign, and in that campaign, we forewarn people, presumably before they're sitting in a situation where they have to decide if they want to engage in risky or unprotected sex behavior, right? If we forewarn them of all the potential negative outcomes resulting from such a decision or such an action, then according to this perspective, we have essentially given them a set of reasons that would allow them to reject that behavior in the future before they even are exposed to that persuasive attempt, okay? So, for example, obviously, risky sex behavior, there are lots of unintended outcomes that can result, right? We have the potential for transmission of STDs. We have the potential for unwanted pregnancies. We have the potential for contracting HIV or the AIDS virus, right? So these are all of these negative outcomes. There's obviously an emotional and a cognitive component to risky sex behavior as well, right? And so, those are other aspects. Maybe they're not as life or death threatening, but those are other negative components that we could also weave into a forewarning message, right? So according to this model, if you are getting people together, and in this case, we're trying to target high school students to not engage in risky sex behavior, right? So if you forewarn them of all the different types of negative outcomes that can result from that decision to engage in risky sex behavior, according to this perspective, they have already been warned, and so they are more likely to have the ability to develop counter arguments to the message where someone might be trying to convince them to engage in risky sex behavior, okay? Another way that this could play out is in a forewarning campaign. You might also present various types of excuses that a persuader might use to try to get someone to adopt a certain attitude or behavior, right? So you could inoculate people by providing the excuses that somebody might give them for why they should engage in risky sex behavior. So one excuse could be, "Oh, well, don't you trust me?" Right? And another excuse could be, "Oh, well, we're in love and everything's fine and we don't have to worry about tomorrow. Let's live for today," right? So these are all potential ways that you can essentially forewarn someone about what they might be exposed to. And also, you can provide various responses that they could evoke when they are faced with that situation, right? You could say, well, if somebody says, "Don't you love me enough to engage in unprotected sex," a good response to that might be, "Well, from my perspective, if you love and respect me, then you'll respect my decision to want to protect myself," right? So you can provide people with a set of stimuli, you can provide them with a set of responses, and obviously you can provide them with a set of potential negative outcomes that result from risky sex behavior. And in that sense, they have been forewarned so that if they do face a situation in the future where somebody is attempting to persuade them to do that, they have already had a chance to develop a lot of counter arguments, so they're less likely to adopt that risky position or that risky behavior because they have been forewarned. Now, another thing that's really important in terms of the cognitive response model is this idea of distraction. So from this perspective, if you are able to distract people from the actual message, right, then they're more likely to accept the message because they're not going to be critically processing it or coming up with a lot of mental objections to the advocated position, right? So, for example, we can use the advertising industry and their incessant development of alcohol advertisements, all right? When you watch these alcohol advertisements, you tend to see oftentimes people who are usually young and fit, good-looking, popular. They tend to look like they're more affluent, right? They tend to be having a really good time with their friends. They're in really nice, fun social situations, or, you know, watching the game or engaging in, you know, activities that people tend to find enjoyable. A lot of times in these advertisements, you'll also see or hear music that's stimulating, or music that is popular, or music that people like, right? Music that's invigorating or makes people feel kind of up, right? You also might see various other types of messages, like people are being accepted by their peers, they're popular, you know, the women are, you know, embracing, or women like men who drink a strong drink, or men like women who are able to drink Bud Light with the guys, or, you know, whatever that message is, right? These are all various types of distractions that basically work to distract us away from the ultimate message, which is you should drink a lot of alcohol regularly, right? And so typically in these kinds of advertisements, we are distracted by all of the positive potential outcomes that could develop with drinking alcohol, right? And so we don't tend to critically assess all of the negative things that we know take place from either our own experiences or watching the people that we love drink too much alcohol, and some of the negative outcomes, you know, that can play out from that, right? So these advertisements that tend to sensationalize and sexualize and really put a positive spin on the process of drinking, essentially they are distracting us by all of these sensationalized cues, whether it's music or colors or beautiful people or lots of fun, or, you know, riding around on a boat or on a yacht or in an airplane, or, you know, whatever it is, a sports car, you know, I mean, there's all these different types of cues that are used to try to evoke these responses in us, right? So a lot of those cues that are used are distractions in a sense, and those distractions, according to the cognitive response model, make it less likely that we are actually going to be critical about the message, which is, of course, you should drink a lot of alcohol and you should do it on a regular basis, right? So if we're distracted by listening to the music or the colors or the people, we're not going to be thinking about the fact that regular alcohol consumption can lead to alcoholic behavior, which, of course, alcoholism is a major disease in society among millions of people today. And on a more life or death scenario, we all know from stories or from listening to, you know, various PSAs or from hearing what our friends have gone through, we know what can happen when people drink alcohol too much, right? So it's important to be aware of how advertisements can use distraction. And if you are, you know, attempting to persuade people of a message that they may find objectionable, then, you know, you could potentially use the distraction method as well to try to distract them from the actual message so that they don't object. On a broader level, I think it's very important for us to become conscious of the way in which our own cognition is also influencing our behaviors, whether it's with pro-arguments, counter-arguments, or whether we are being influenced by forewarning or distraction techniques by advertising industries or persuaders. Now, the elaboration likelihood model takes a cognitive approach still, but they tend to break the cognition down into two types of processing, okay? According to ELM, generally speaking, people tend to engage in one of two routes for processing. Sometimes people might engage in the central processing route. Central processors, or if someone is processing a message centrally in that moment, tend to be focused on the logic and the depth of the argument, credibility issues for the source. Okay, do I believe this source? Are they making a good logical argument? Are these facts and figures, and are these things that I think are important? Okay. People that are using a peripheral processing method are tuning in more to superficial cues. Okay. Now, we talked about superficial cues in the previous slide, right? And superficial cues can involve anything from colors to good-looking people to humor to music, to various types of funny situations or things that, generally don't really have much to do with the quality of the argument about a persuasive campaign or message, but they tend to actually be fairly persuasive in certain situations. So let's get into this a little bit more and explore the central and the peripheral processing routes. Again, before we get into this in more detail, the peripheral processors tend to be engaging in a mental heuristic shortcut. So basically what this means is I might be more persuaded by an advertisement because I really like the actors that are in it, or I think it's really funny, and I may not give much thought to how favorable a product is, or really how substantial the actual message is in terms of argument quality, but I might be persuaded just by things that allow me to kind of jump to a mental shortcut in terms of conclusions I might reach about a given message. So, according to the ELM, people are motivated to process based on different needs, okay? So, people who are very involved in a message or involved in a topic or an issue are going to tend to process something more closely or more carefully, right? This is probably not very surprising. And when we talk about involvement, that can mean anything from this is an issue that you've experienced in your life. This is something that you're currently dealing with. This is perhaps an issue that you know a lot about, all right? So our level of involvement will basically shape the way that we process a given message. And of course, as I just said, involvement deals with how important this topic is or this issue is in our life. So, generally speaking, people who have high involvement in an issue or a topic tend to process things in a more central way. They're going to analyze the argument quality. They're going to look at the logic of the argument. They're going to look at facts and figures and statistics and numbers and things that really support, is this a position that is valid and legitimate? These people are also going to be much more focused on the argument, okay? They're going to be concerned and attending to the quality of the argument, the way in which the argument is constructed, and whether the argument is laid out in a logical, coherent fashion. People who tend to be less involved or have low involvement with the topic are more likely, according to ELM, to process things in a peripheral way. So, people who process things in a peripheral way might tune into things like humor, or they like the music in the ad, or they might just accept that the person who's speaking in the advertisement or who's speaking in the campaign is an expert source, right? And they might just say, well, this person's an expert, I'm just going to believe them. I'm not going to really analyze the argument very much. I'm just going to believe what this person says because they're a doctor or because they're wearing a white lab coat or whatever, okay? So these are all very important things to think about according to the elaboration likelihood model. Elaboration likelihood model suggests that there are several things other than motivation or involvement that influence how we process messages. One of these things is ability. So obviously certain situations can either inhibit or enhance our ability to process a certain message. So we can think about, for example, a situation where we're very distracted. Maybe we're distracted by the fact that we're hungry, or we're having mental thoughts about something we have to do later, or perhaps there's people that are around us that are distracting us, right? This type of ability will influence whether we can process a message and whether we are persuaded. The context also will shape whether we're persuaded. Obviously, if we're sitting in a room by ourselves, absorbing a message or listening to a message, that message is potentially going to be more persuasion-oriented for us versus if we're sitting in a room with 20 or 30 people listening to the same message, right? The context with which we find ourselves when we absorb or internalize a message can shape how we respond to the message. If you have a whole classroom of students around you, when you are listening to a message and everybody has a similar reaction and you listen, you're hearing people's responses and comments and ideas while the message is being delivered, then that context, that social context, will shape whether you're persuaded and potentially how you're persuaded. Distraction generally tends to inhibit or reduce persuasion, and so this is why when we think about processing messages and setting up our campaigns or any kind of a persuasive message, we want to do all we can from our source perspective to reduce distraction, right? So we can think about when we give a public speech. There are any number of things that a public speaker can be doing that will distract the audience from the actual message, right? So you can distract people by the way that you're dressed. Perhaps your clothing or your attire is not entirely appropriate, or maybe it's distracting because people keep looking at a certain aspect of your outfit that could be drawing attention. So as public speakers, as professionals in the organizational and corporate world, we want to be thinking about those things, right? What are some things that we can do to minimize distractions with the audience that might be listening to us? And clearly, the way that we stylize ourselves is one huge factor. The way that we speak is another huge factor in persuasion. So with the language we use and the way that we deliver our verbal and nonverbal messages, we want to minimize distraction. We want to speak in a way that is clear and concise. We want to speak in a way where we actually believe what we're saying, right? We don't want to deliver messages with a lot of hesitations or different types of cues that make our audience question whether we even believe what we're saying ourselves. We also want to work to use language that is non-inflammatory, that does not use slang or swear words or anything that would be considered inappropriate, right? These are all different types of communication cues that can distract an audience, which of course can reduce persuasion. So we want to be thinking about this as we go into our campaigns and also when we engage in educational and professional communication, whether it's with one person, 5 people, or with 50 or 100, or even more. Another main thing that ELM talks about is knowledge and the fact that knowledge impacts persuasion. So generally speaking, if I have more knowledge about a topic, then I am going to engage in central processing with regards to that topic, okay? That makes sense, right? If we know a lot about an issue, we're going to expect the persuader to have their facts and their figures and their main assumptions in order, right? And if they don't, then they're going to lose a lot of credibility, and obviously we're not going to be persuaded by that message. On the other hand, if we have less knowledge about a topic, then we are more likely to be persuaded by more peripheral or heuristic shortcut cues, such as the expert opinion of like an expert authority, right? Such as a doctor or a teacher or someone like that. We may also be more persuaded by other superficial peripheral cues, such as music or humor or colors or attractive actors or things like that, right? So one of the things that we can do with information like this is we can set up our message in a way where we try to gauge our audience in terms of their ability, okay? We try to control the environment as much as possible in terms of the context so that we are able to deliver the message so that people are actually able to really tune into us, okay? Now, you can't totally control context, but you can certainly control the message that you set up. You can certainly control other types of distractions that may have to do with your own delivery or how you look or speak or things like that. And finally, One thing you can always do to enhance persuasiveness is to learn about your audience prior to developing the message. So, for example, if I know that my audience is going to have a lot of knowledge about the topic that I'm about to speak about, then I am going to try to hone in or reinforce those types of ideas or principles that are more central to the argument quality, okay? On the other hand, if I know from my prior research that the audience has less knowledge about the topic, I still want to have a good, credible argument, but I may want to infuse the message with lots of peripheral cues that would be more likely to enhance them adopting the message because of the fact that they have less knowledge. So these are all things we can think about in terms of our persuadability and our ability to persuade people, both in terms of interpersonal communication, in terms of our educational interactions, and of course, clearly our professional communication in the future. You can also even look at your own processing tendencies. So next time you see advertisements about any number of things, whether it's a car or a vacation or alcohol or a cell phone or a new computer, you can think about, well, am I processing this message in a central way or in a peripheral way? And do I want to be processing this message in this way? Okay, so one of the benefits of knowing about these tendencies is we can then become more conscious of our own tendencies as human beings so that we can make mindful choices about the attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that we adopt. Inoculation theory is the final theory we're going to talk about in this chapter, and this theory basically assumes that if we are able to provide information to people or a group of people prior to them encountering a situation or a negative threat or interest, then we can minimize the likelihood that they will be influenced by that unethical situation, threat, or scenario. So by inoculating people prior to the situation that they may encounter, we allow them or provide them with a way to reduce the threat so that they can decide before they go into the situation not to make a decision that could be risky or negative. And in doing this, we are able to inoculate them from negative outcomes. So, for example, we could point out in a public service announcement the dangerous and unethical or undesirable outcomes that can emerge when people drink excessively, or when people drink and drive, or when people engage in risky sex behavior, or when people smoke cigarettes or vapors, right? Now the biggest rave is the vapes. So, there's all sorts of different types of behaviors that we can inoculate people against. We might even think about inoculating people against a unhealthy sedentary lifestyle, right? There's been a lot more attention lately in the public service announcements about healthy eating and exercise and teaching your children about, eating healthy and training them to exercise at a young age so that they don't become obese and develop conditions like type 2 diabetes and, heart disease and all of these things, right? So inoculation theory is one perspective that allows us to think about basically trying to prevent a behavior from taking place in the future by giving people the information they need beforehand so that they can make an informed decision for the best or most ideal or most healthy outcome in the future. Ideally, if inoculation theory is applied correctly, that should strengthen a person's stance against any kind of a negative issue or negative situation prior to them being exposed to it. And because of that, they're more likely to make the right choice, which of course can prevent negative outcomes. And just to conclude this lecture, the inoculation theory research that has been done by people like Pfau have actually found that if we are able to develop attitudes in people that are stronger prior to them facing a situation, then those stronger attitudes are going to be more accessible when the situation comes up, right? So using inoculation theory, if we're able to cultivate a negative attitude in high school students towards drinking and driving prior to them getting their license, let's say, right? Then by the time they get their license, when they go to that first party and somebody offers them alcohol, they are less likely, of course, to drink and drive because they've already had the ability to develop a strong negative attitude towards drinking and driving. That attitude should be accessible already because they have already been persuaded. And that attitude is also going to be more resistant to attack by other people who may be attempting to persuade people to engage in risky behavior, okay? And obviously, if there's an attitude that's more accessible and it's resistant to attack, then that also bolsters the mind-emotion link. So when I commit to a belief, and let's say in my head right now, and most of you probably agree with me, okay, drinking and driving is extremely dangerous, all right? Most of us can agree with that, I would say, given what we've seen on the news and things like that, right? So in my mind, drinking and driving is extremely dangerous, all right? Emotionally, I know what can happen when people make that fatal decision to drink and drive. We've all heard those stories. We've all seen those videos. We know the kinds of lives that can be wrecked and ruined and devastated when somebody makes that terrible decision. So emotionally, I can feel that emotional connection to what happens when people make that decision, right? It's devastating. It's a terrible emotional experience to watch people that you love suffering because somebody got into the car and drove drunk, and now someone you know is going to be suffering for the rest of their life in a wheelchair or something, right? So because of these types of campaigns, we can expect, based on the research of FAO and others, those attitudes will be stronger, they're more accessible. Obviously, in a campaign that is seeking to inoculate people against drinking and driving, you would want to lay out cognitive facts and figures, but you also want to appeal to people emotionally, right? Emotional cues, ways that people are able to feel about what it, feel how it feels to have to be observing or witnessing people we love and care about dealing with these terrible situations. And based on being resistant to the attack and that mental emotional connection, we would expect that the message is more persuasive. So inoculation theory is also something you can think about. I know that you're at the point right now where you're starting to think about your persuasive campaigns. So please do think about these theories in terms of the various topics that you're considering adopting for those campaigns. You can think about this idea of inoculating people against the negative behavior. You can think about the elaboration likelihood model and what that would say about how to best persuade people. You can also think about other models such as the Hovland model of persuasion and, of course, the cognitive response model, which deals with pro-arguments and counter-arguments. Thank you for your attention. I hope that this chapter was informative for you, and I will talk to everyone in the next chapter. Have a good day.